Good afternoon, everybody, and on behalf of all of us here in the Fáilte Ireland team, can I express a warm welcome to all of you again for taking the time to be with us for our webinar this afternoon, and to thank you in particular for your advanced contribution to the webinar by submitting some questions to us, which has really helped us guide the specific information that we're going to focus on today in the time available to us. In some respects, it's actually hard to believe. It's been 8 weeks ago now, on the 31st of March, since we brought you our last HR webinar around managing risk associated with temporary closure regarding COVID. Now, 2 months later, as we look ahead to the government's phased reopening for Ireland and our tourism industry and hospitality industry, it's important really that we take the time now to ensure we carefully manage those HR risks associated with ensuring a safe reopening of your business and a return to the workplace for as many of your staff as possible. I hope you've all taken the time to review the recently published HR for Reopening video series on our COVID-19 Business Supports Hub under our business recovery pages, and we'll be sharing that link with you now if you haven't, because these really provide critical guidance to you around the subject area that we're going to elaborate and delve a little bit deeper on today. So some of the basics around these topics we're going to cover is covered in those videos, and it's really important for you to have a look at them. And lastly, I think today, in order to make the session a little bit more possibly engaging for you and to help you feel connected to the hundreds of others that are on the webinar with us, we'd like to actually share with you today a few question polls that we'll place strategically throughout the webinar, which will give you an indication to, and I invite you to respond to those questions very briefly, but it'll give you an indication of where everybody else is at in this process around getting ready for reopening in the context of managing HR. So to begin with, I'd like to welcome back our subject matter expert, Caroline McEnery, to our live broadcast today. Good afternoon, Caroline, and welcome back. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
For those of you joining us for the first time, Caroline, as you may not know, is an experienced HR and law expert, having set up the HR suite in 2009. She's also a former member of the Low Pay Commission, and she acts as an adjudication officer in the Workplace Relations Commission. So for the purpose of our HR for reopening today, I'm going to begin with looking at a brief overview of the HR for Reopening Guidance Suite that we did, that video suite that we uploaded last week to the website, and during which Caroline will call out some of the important considerations in each of the 3 video topics that we have addressed as part of the guidance suite. And as well as that, we will then look at some of the HR risks across this whole area, been mindful of the need to look at this in the context of reopening and planning for that, and in preparing for a workplace for the safe return of staff and customers. We'll then address some of the more pertinent and recurring advanced questions that you submitted to us before we progress to some live questions and answers. And should we run out of time before we manage to cover everybody's questions, please note that we will attempt to address anything uncovered in a subsequent FAQ document, which we're completing and adding to our web page on HR for Reopening that will support the webinar. So watch out for that as well. And assisting me today is my colleague Karen Curry, who will be fielding some of your live questions, in so many as we can get through in the time allowed. So you're welcome in the course of the webinar to pop your questions in the question function to the right-hand side of your webinar screen to post your questions to us by chat box. And finally, before I begin, I would just like to note that some of the questions that were posed to us in advance of the webinar relate to the very much anticipated Fáilte Ireland sectoral operational guidelines, which we're currently been finalised in collaboration with industry bodies, relevant state agencies, the Department of Tourism, Transport and Sport, and indeed wider government. And of course, these will further assist your preparations in terms of reopening safely, whilst adhering to public health advice and the government roadmap for reopening. But of course, a robust scrutiny of the guidelines is really essential to ensure that industry and the general public have the full confidence in the ability of us in the tourism sector to reopen safely. And as our consumer research has already identified, health and safety protocols are actually among the premises most important attributes to communicate, as safe breaks are emerging as very strong themes in our consumer research as people plan their domestic holidays. So to clarify, the operational guidelines are outside of the remit of this HR webinar today, but they will be addressed in full when the guidelines themselves are published, which we expect very soon. So just for today's webinar then, as I mentioned, we'll revisit the key takeaways from the HR for Reopening video series. We will overview the key risks associated with reopening. We'll address the pertinent questions you've submitted. We will move then to live Q&A, and then we'll just do a brief recap at the end in terms of our supports. So to begin with, then, in terms of the video suite that we have uploaded to our HR for Reopening page, the first video is really focusing on the employer's role in providing a safe place of work. And really this requires us to address the necessary revisions to the existing HR policies and staff handbooks that you would all have for your business. And it looks also at the necessary staff consultation and communications in making arrangements for employees' safe return to the workplace. So Colette, before I go over to Caroline to ask her for the top tips, are we able to present the poll for the second question? So as the poll asks us there, you might give us your views in terms of whether you have started to update your COVID policy for staff and any other HR policies and practices as reflected within your handbook. And if you can give us a quick answer on that, we'll be able to share with you the overall sentiment of the audience in regard to that area. But while we wait for the results of that poll, Caroline, maybe you'd give us your top tips and key takeaways that people should be conscious of in considering that insights from the video on the employer's role in providing a safe place of work.
Yeah, Amanda, I suppose we tried to make the videos as practical as possible so that we gave those viewing them kind of really practical insights. And the first consideration is you have a lot of people who might be concerned about returning to work and managing the absence around, you know, people's concerns in relation to returning. So that might be people who have underlying health conditions. It might be people who have somebody at home that is considered to be vulnerable, or indeed they might be happy to stay at home to facilitate childcare. So there's lots of different challenges about returning, and one key one is to ensure that you update your policy and then also do lots of consultation and engagement to address all those different challenges about returning. The other key point to note is the importance of the paper trail. So again, even communicating with staff, for example, in relation to what you have done in terms of the measures that you've put in place, in terms of the feedback around taking their concerns on board, and also the fact you've updated your COVID policy, you've circulated it to all staff. Now we're at a new phase of reopening, and you've also got staff to sign that off, because in HR the paper trail is crucially important to ensure that we can ensure that everybody has been communicated a consistent message that we can apply consistently also.
Great. And Caroline, this is a legal obligation enforceable by the HSA, isn't that right?
Yeah, the return to work safely protocol, which is going to be discussed in video 2 in more detail, is a legislative requirement. However, ultimately, assisting people in terms of return, we are worried, I suppose, that you could potentially get yourself in hot water if you were to refuse, for example, to hold somebody's job open due to childcare issues or associated with health concerns without getting a doctor's update. So there's lots of legal obligations in relation to this, underpinned in the current legislation already in relation to employment law, and new ones now associated with the return to work safely protocol.
Great, and that's all discussed, of course, in detail about looking at the individual circumstances of those vulnerable people within the video there. So before we just return to the video, before we look at video 2, Colette, do we have the results of that poll? Okay, so that's really positive sign there. We can see that about almost 70% of people have started to look at updating their COVID policy. I know that, you know, businesses were very quick to put out a COVID policy for customers, but if it's something that you haven't necessarily given due attention to for your staff, you would need a similar policy in regard to your staff. And you also need to look at, as Caroline said, those other HR policies and practices as would be reflected in your handbook. So for those of you still to start, I hope today provides you kind of an inspiration and some insights that will help you get on your way in that regard. So in regard to video 2, this second video that we covered looked specifically at some of the new responsibilities associated with the return to work safety protocol requirements, which Caroline was referring to there. So this is a new set of responsibilities and measures that are required specifically to support employees against COVID-19 in return to the workplace, and then how the business needs to manage suspected and outbreak cases in line with GDPR. So Caroline, maybe you'd give us just some top tips and highlights there to concentrate people's minds on in regards to looking at those obligations.
So I suppose the first starting point is to do a risk assessment for your business. And the risk assessment will look at 2 areas. One is the staff flow from when they arrive, literally all the touch points and risks associated with the spread of COVID-19. And then you would do the same exercise from a customer flow. And then once you identify what are the risks, you're to put measures in place to reduce or eliminate those risks. The risk assessment is a very good starting point. I think it's very good practice that it's done internally because you know your own business best. We've given you some guidelines in relation to how to do that. And ultimately then, once you are doing your staff training, you can use that to tailor your training, because even though there's generic guidelines out there, what's really important is that you take advantage of your internal knowledge base with your staff and your department heads, etc., in relation to potential risks. And there's a requirement to put in place worker representatives to facilitate this collaborative approach. So once you've done that, then the next step is to facilitate your staff training. And some people understand that it's only people who are returning, but for those that have been working right throughout the pandemic because they might have been providing, you know, takeaway or different other services, this requirement is for all staff that they would receive this training. And the training is very, I suppose, broad, it's very proactive, and it means that everybody is coming in at the same level of awareness and understanding to reduce risk, which is what we're really focused on. I think the good thing also about this protocol is it's instilling confidence in staff in terms of facilitating their return, which is very important. And the final, I suppose, key point to take away from video 2 is we still have to be very conscious in relation to how do we handle staff who have symptoms, how do we handle suspected cases, etc. So again, you're reminding staff in relation to the protocol associated with that, and also the obligation on us to, as employers, to ensure that we manage medical data and personal data very carefully and sensitively in line with our GDPR obligations.
Yeah, I suppose 2 things to call out there, Caroline. First of all, to let everybody know that there's a very good checklist on the HSA website. If you look at their website search under COVID templates and checklists, there's a really good checklist there for that induction training for staff. There's equally good checklists for employees and for that worker representative role as well. So that's a really good way to do it. And Caroline, I suppose a question that came through in our advanced questions there, you know, is it feasible for the training to be done remotely and online, or does it have to be done face to face? And I suppose it's likely to be a combination of those. What's your own thoughts on that?
I suppose my preferred approach is that it's done remotely. We've lots of good technology now to facilitate tailored webinars, virtual training online that can be done tailored to suit organizations. So I think that would be the best approach. And I think employers feel then that they have the chance of doing it proactively, because the advice with all of this is to do it early. So even though you mightn't have people returning for a couple of weeks, depending on what stage you're at, I would advise that the sooner you do this, the better, because you're getting people into the right mindset. And remember, if people are on the wage subsidy scheme, that we can encourage them, and we should be encouraging them to do different types of training, and there's lots of options around that. So I think that's a very good question, Amanda, in terms of approach. I think it's going to be very difficult to do the classroom type learning for the numbers of people. If you've only a very small number and lots of space, it might be more feasible, but I think it's a better use of technology, etc., now to do that. But the important thing is you need to keep a record of the sign off, because the Health and Safety Authority are enforcing this, that we are doing it proactively as employers. We've already seen that they've proactively been doing inspections, and if you're not compliant, they're giving you an improvement notice to address it. So I suppose you want to be ahead of the curve in this regard, and the sooner the communication happens, the sooner you do the filling in of the forms in terms of the return to work form, the sooner you do the training, the sooner you do the communication. I think you instill confidence early with people, and I think that's good for business and good for staff morale and confidence.
Great. We'll come back to that return to work form in just a moment. So looking then at the third video that was done, which really reflects a lot of the changes to working hours and arrangements. And I suppose this is the video that takes through an awful lot of detail in regard to looking at the implications for aligning your HR strategy and resource requirements in accordance with your revised business strategy and business projections. And looking at then the advice on handling changes to the working arrangements, and of course the necessary consultation, communications and paper trail around managing that. And it takes us in depth, Caroline, to the specifics around looking at that last resort requirement of redundancy in the event that that's necessary in the business. So maybe before we go to just pull out the key points around that third video that you'd like to stress, we might, Colette, have the next poll, which is really around managing staff communications around reopening, and where people, to get a sense of where people are at in regard to that, and have you started to look at the staff roles required to reopen. So Caroline, over to you then, just in terms of this third video. And I suppose if I was to contextualize it, this is where an awful lot of the advanced questions have come to us in regard to, you know, the redundancy. And what I would say to people is some of the questions you've asked are clearly covered in the video. So I will really strongly urge you to go back and watch the videos again. But Caroline, pull out maybe the key tips for us in terms of considerations on this third video.
I suppose the key emphasis throughout is you need to identify what is your business strategy and then align the HR strategy to it, because businesses are looking at different and new ways of reopening, different maybe formats, different sizes, different scales, and that may present challenges in relation to staff reduction of hours, staff wage reduction, changes in terms of working arrangements. It may need short time, or indeed it may need redundancy. With all of the above, I suppose it's ensuring that you do it legally compliant. So if we talk about, I suppose, changes in terms of working hours, whether that's associated with wages, hours, etc., that needs to be done in consultation and agreement with staff. And again, the paper trail there is very important. And we're finding that, you know, as we engage with staff, staff are very aware of the legitimate grounds for needing to do this to keep businesses alive and to assist with cash flow, etc. So we're finding a very cooperative approach in that regard. The other piece, I suppose, is if you're looking at changes in terms of, for example, short time, if you're looking for reduced hours, if you're looking at redundancy, etc., the selection criteria needs to be objectively justified. So that objective justification is crucially important. So it can't be based on performance unless you have been giving performance feedback to staff very proactively and transparently, which most businesses wouldn't. So again, looking at the selection criteria, and that can be last in, first out. That can be, we're looking at the actual skills matrix as another criteria. So again, that might be a department. So for example, you might no longer have a laundry department, so you're outsourcing the laundry, for example. So you need to, I suppose, be very clear and transparent in relation to what grounds you're using. And also, as you consult with staff, the importance of the consultation process can't be underestimated, because our obligation here is to ensure that we explore all avenues, and that requires very thorough and recorded consultation. And normally that's a couple of meetings to engage with the parties to hear what they have to say and what their views are. And I suppose my view is, when there's no surprises, you get a much better engagement from people. So again, communicating early, communicating often in relation to what are the expectations, and then making sure you do the paper trail that goes with it. And I think listeners will find the videos helpful in that regard, because we've really taken through the step-by-step approach around all of those changes to working hours and arrangements that we've mentioned, up to and including collective redundancy.
Great. So Colette, if we have the results of that last poll, we might just throw it up there. Okay, so we are less, I suppose, definitive about whether or not we have a communications plan ready and in place, and whether we've determined roles required to reopen. But it's good to see that, you know, combined between the yes and the somewhat, we're on the road to that. But for those maybe who haven't started, you know, we hope again today is a stimulus to actually help you get started in that. Because I think when you go through that third video, I was quite struck by how much time that whole process will take you to do and to engage with very carefully, and to get that consultation right, as Caroline has pointed out to us today. So just I wanted to also then just flag to you the other supporting resources to the video suite, because the video covers the kind of basic steps, but there's scenarios that we presented in the FAQ guidance document that is relevant to the videos that we've done. So please do read that in conjunction with the videos, because if you have questions arising from the videos, it's quite possible we have them answered in the scenarios and the FAQ guidance document that supports it. As Caroline indicated as well there, we have a comprehensive planning checklist available to you to assist you plan that return to work safety protocol requirements. And within that as well, there's kind of guidance as well around that role for the worker representative that we spoke about. And Caroline, just a point there on that worker representative, we have a question there from Marie, and the question is, does the worker representative have to be a member of line staff, or can it be part of the management team?
I suppose the idea is that you would have a representative group. So depending on the number of staff you have, you may have more than one person. I suppose the whole idea of it is that it's done collaboratively. So again, you might have a number of people from different departments involved. And I think it would be better to have a couple of people rather than just one person in case they were out sick, etc., depending on the size of your business. And I think it's important to have a mix of staff, because at the end of the day, otherwise it will turn out that you'll have staff raising grievances because they feel they're not being heard, if it is the case we don't give them that opportunity to be heard as we go along. So I think it would be a good approach to involve a number of people so that it's done collaboratively in that regard.
Great, thank you. And I suppose, Colette, I just asked you to pop back there. I just missed that fourth video, which is one that we had planned on filming with the others, but we held back a little bit on that, because this is the one video that really will give you guidance and clarity around the expected continuation or otherwise of the employment supports and payments. And we had expected that updates from government imminently. So we anticipate that that will be videoed in the coming week. And we will alert you when that does come in to us over the coming week, and we'll alert you when it's live on the website as well for you to have a look at. But that should give some of you that I know are awaiting kind of clarity as to what is likely to happen in terms of the expected extension of some of those supports or the phasing down of those supports, and also in regard to that critical question at the moment, Caroline, where we have a situation where the employee is paused from being able to initiate redundancy options, and the employer, the employee doesn't have the option to pursue that. But that's likely to be changing too shortly. Is there anything you want to comment on that, Caroline?
So actually, that was the only part of the announcement we did get clarification on last Friday, where the government have confirmed that they're extending the opportunity for the pausing of that redundancy legislation. So at the moment, employers can make employees redundant, but employees can't request to be made redundant up to the 10th of August. It's unlikely that they'll extend it, too much longer. If they do even extend it past the 10th of August, it's unlikely it'll be much further than that, because I suppose at that stage it's expected that businesses will be back up and running and will have made the decisions in relation to who's coming back, what roles are going to be viable going forward, etc. So that update came through, which is helpful, because again, it'll help businesses know, and I think it had to be updated till then because a number of businesses are still closed up to that point. So that's the latest update in relation to that.
Great, okay, so that's just one to look out for folks to be conscious of. So Caroline, just summarising then the risks as you see them, really, the key risks around reopening.
So I suppose from a HR perspective, I find that people are being very proactive in terms of planning, which is really good to see. And I think the polls echo that again today. And that's good to see. I suppose sometimes you don't know what you don't know, though. And that's why hopefully the videos, the FAQs, the checklists, all that information that we've given you, hopefully will help you in terms of planning that next phase. So if we were to look at what are the key risks, and these are just some of the top ones, I suppose there's a lot of businesses looking at redundancies, and we're seeing that coming through in the questions in advance of today. And ultimately, the key thing about a redundancy is it isn't a person, it is the position you make redundant. And therefore, that objectively justified criteria is crucially important, and that you can stand over a claim that somebody says, look, I was made redundant because of my age, because of my gender, equality related, or actually I was made redundant to do with performance, which would all be illegal grounds for redundancy. So again, just making sure that it is the position, not the person, that you focus on when you are looking at redundancy. The next point, I suppose, flows from that, but it's probably broader than that, because we mention a lot in HR the importance of objectively justified criteria and the transparency that's required when we are, for example, bringing people back to work. So if there's a cohort of 10 people, for example, in a department, we need to be able to justify how we choose people to return. We need to be able to show how we chose people to reduce hours, choose for redundancy, etc. And all of those require that objectively justified criteria that we mentioned that we can stand over. I suppose the other concern is in relation to changing terms and conditions. A lot of businesses are struggling, and they will need to get staff's cooperation in relation to changing terms and conditions, but making sure you do that with agreement and do it via the paper trail, so that it doesn't become an issue in a couple of months' time where you potentially have a payment to wages case or something along those lines. So again, just being conscious of that. And I suppose overall, I think the employer brand and morale is a hugely, important consideration for all people working, particularly in a service-based industry. And people do such good work at building the employer brand and morale that, if the staff member feels that they haven't been treated fairly, like the old saying where people will remember not alone what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel, that importance of really engaging very proactively with your staff. That's both the staff that are out on COVID payment and those that are out on the wage subsidy, because keeping them up to date, even if it's only an update to say, look, we're going into the next phase now, what does that mean? What are we doing behind the scenes? What are we thinking? What does the next number of weeks look like? People really appreciate getting those updates, and I think it's important again to instill confidence in people. The other important thing to look at, I suppose, is that, you know, there's a lot of legal obligations that we've gone through today. And, you know, if any of this, when you watch the videos or when you look at any of the questions and you still feel, okay, I'm not quite sure in relation to that, I would always say get advice, because you can't know everything. And sometimes, because you may never have needed to look at redundancy, or you may never have needed to look at something very significant before, it's important. So, you know, just to keep that in mind. So tread carefully, and remember, at the end of the day, you're all doing your very, very best in difficult times, and that's appreciated. But if you need additional guidance, make sure to ask. All right.
Great, lovely. Thank you for that, Caroline. So moving on then, we might begin, Caroline, with looking at some of the most pertinent questions submitted that kind of repeated themselves quite a lot in different contexts for the audience ahead of today. The first one is, can employees invoke the option to be made redundant if they remain on layoff?
So it's important to be aware of the fact that, as we mentioned, the legislation has been changed so that it is paused until the 10th of August, where an employee can't invoke the option to be made redundant if they're on layoff. However, from the 10th of August, we await to see if that's going to be extended, but I wouldn't necessarily be planning for that to be the case. I'd make your decisions now in light that that could change from the 10th of August.
Okay. And how do you manage part-time employees' redundancy? Now, that rings a little bit of a warning bell with me. Would you not adapt the same principles as you would for reviewing full-time employees' redundancy?
Absolutely, and I think sometimes we forget that if you have part-time employees or those working less hours, they are entitled to the exact same treatment as somebody who is working full-time hours. So, for example, if you're looking at redundancy, if you're looking at reducing people's hours, etc., it must be done based on objectively justified criteria, which isn't, well, we let the part-timers go first, for example. That's illegal to do that. So again, I suppose it's a great question, because again, it's back to the point, you don't know what you don't know. And I'm always a big believer in the importance of asking the question, because lots of other people will benefit from it as well. But in the case of redundancy, which is their specific question, it needs to be objective grounds, and the type of contract they're on wouldn't lend itself to that being an objectively justified criteria.
And I suppose, Caroline, in some respects, it's fair to say in our industry, you know, which has its peaks and troughs, and when we start to look beyond, you know, what we hope will be the immediate flow and curve and uplift for domestic holidays in the summer, you know, the flexibility that part-time workers as well can give you is really important. But you made a very valid point previous to this around the flexibility of workers, and that is, you know, if you're making your decision about the flexibility of workers, you probably need to go back to those same workers again and ask them the question, because their flexibility may have changed in light of COVID, or they may be open to different areas of flexibility in that regard. Is that fair to say?
I suppose my advice to clients is to literally start asking all your staff now, in terms of, once you have an expected date of reopening, that you would engage with all staff and clarify with them, just want to check your availability to return. Has anything changed from your perspective? Is there any information you need to share with us in that regard to assist us in terms of planning, and also get them to fill in their return to work form? Now, that doesn't need to be filled in until a couple of days, 3 days actually, before their return. But what you can do is get them to fill it in and let them know that if anything changes, they can come back and engage with you. Because the benefit of doing it well in advance means that if, for example, they have concerns around childcare, their own health, vulnerable people in their household, etc., you can start engagement with them now in relation to those types of issues rather than leaving them to the last minute, because all of those require lots of HR engagement, consultation, reasonability, fairness, etc. So my advice would be start engaging sooner with your team in relation to planning the return.
Great. And another question here then. I have an employee out on sick leave and I don't feel I will have worked for them now in light of COVID. Can I make them redundant?
Oh, that's a very tricky question.
Yeah.
The reason being is, I suppose, that they are, just because they've been out sick, they can't be disadvantaged in any way. So if, for example, we'll use the laundry department, if they're coming back to work in the laundry department and all staff in the laundry department are being made redundant, well, then that's legitimate. But if it's just that person coming back into a department that others are working in, that will pose you a problem, because if somebody's been out, depending on what they've been out for, it could be defined as a disability in line with equality legislation. So I would tread very carefully, especially to do with equality, and equality covers pregnant employees, age, gender, etc., all of those grounds around equality. So tread very carefully. And again, you can't really, I suppose, make a decision until you have the full facts. So today we're limited in that regard, but I would say tread very carefully in that regard.
Great. And then I think we've covered this, but when will we know if the PUP work, wage subsidy scheme and other schemes are to be continued?
So we are waiting patiently in the wings. We had hoped that that would be last Friday, but now we're hoping that we'll know in the next week or so. I suppose we have prepared a fourth video, which is talking you through the different schemes and the updates, and that'll be live literally as soon as we get the update from the government. Our intent is that will be with you immediately at that stage. So we're very much trying to be proactive in keeping you informed in that regard.
Yeah, so we kind of expect that imminently. And then the final question from the advanced ones is how is the issue regarding employees returning from maternity leave been addressed with the recent government announcement last week? Are they entitled to be put on a scheme?
So the good news is that was a real flaw, I suppose, of the scheme in relation to the wage subsidy scheme, which has now been remedied. So it's going to be retrospectively done back to the 26th of March, that people who are back from maternity leave will be eligible to go on that scheme, which is only right. So that's positive news that that's going to be done in that regard.
Great. And before we go over to some live questions from Karen, Colette, we might take our last poll of the webinar, if that is available to us. And it's just to get a sense check from where people are at in terms.
We actually have the first poll available. Apologies.
The first poll available. Great. So we'll go back to the first one actually, yeah, because I think that'll really give us an idea of where people's heads are at in terms of the analysis of their business. So in terms of your HR planning, what is the estimated percentage of your staff you expect to return to the workforce in 2020? And you can give us a sense of that. And of course, everybody's business, will be different in that regard, because some businesses may be more influenced by international visitors, some may be more influenced by local, family, domestic holiday market. So everybody's timelines around when they can, gear up and reboot for recovery post-COVID will be likely to be different, but it's just good to get a sense check of that. So we'll go over to some live, while we're waiting for the sense of the results on that, we'll go over to some live questions now that have been asked. And Caroline, I'll draw on you again for this, if that's all right. Can you spread the working week over 7 days as a form of short time revised hours? And are there rules around this to be aware of?
So the answer is yes. We've covered off short time in one of the videos, which I think you'll find helpful. But short time is when somebody's on a full-time contract, i.e. 5 days, and they're reduced to 3 days or less. So you can't spread it out over the 7 days, because otherwise the person wouldn't be able to get a payment. And also, just in line with the Organisation of Working Time Act, people are entitled to the rest breaks in line with the Organisational Working Time Act, so you couldn't spread them out over 7 days for that reason. Exceptions, like if you had 1 week of, while you're opening, it just happened to be really, really busy and the person was agreeable, that wouldn't be an issue, but it couldn't be something you would be doing much more than that.
Great, okay. And is there an outline anywhere of the training for the lead worker representative? Well, I know there's a lead worker representative checklist on the HSA website.
There is.
Yeah.
There is. That's like we've a very good checklist, to be honest, uploaded to the Fáilte Ireland website to complement the videos, and I think you'll find that very proactive. I suppose the key thing about the worker representative is that it's trying to design it as a collaborative approach, and if you have somebody already who is on a health and safety committee or on a health and safety team, or an employee committee, etc., I think those people would be ideal to assist in this regard. So that might be good to look at.
Great. Another question here: if an employee resigns while on layoff, are there any special arrangements necessary?
The only arrangements would be to ensure that you get their notice in writing, and depending on what the notice says, just to clarify that there are no outstanding issues. But if there's nothing else, there's no issue associated with it.
Great. Is there any update on change the subsidy scheme to address employees who commenced payroll in March 2020 and who were not on payroll in January and February?
So if people weren't on payroll, say, before that date, which is the key date, there has been no leeway. The only leeway that has been made is in relation to some transfer of undertakings that happened within that window, that literally that window that we talk about. But outside of that, they need to be on the payroll.
Okay, and what is your options if the employee refuses to work reduced hours? Coming in there from Richard, question.
So I suppose you have the option of enforcing short time. That's something that you can legally do in line with business requirements, and ultimately I suppose again it's back to the point that we made, which was identify what does your business require, what is your business strategy, and your HR strategy has to align to that. And once you're treating all staff fairly, so for example their categories of staff, or you can explain why you're making the decision you're making, you can legally enforce that once you go through the proper channels of consultation, engagement, etc. So that's an option.
And I suppose in the same way as, refusing to work reduced hours, if there's no underlying health conditions, Caroline, as to why a person can't come back to work when you have work for them, in other words, you are indicating that you want to bring them back on payroll because you're reopening and have work for them, what are your options if they say they don't want to come back?
I suppose it's depending on what is the criteria of why they don't want to come back. Like there's lots of reasons associated with childcare. They're worried for their own health. They're worried for somebody in the household. There's lots of them that have been raising their head this week, particularly as people are facilitating more and more people to go back to work. The important thing for you is the reasonability criteria. And also, I suppose, if it's to do with a medical reason, it needs to be considered by a medical occupational practitioner to give us advice. But if somebody, for example, is on the COVID payment and they don't want to come back because they're on the COVID payment as their reason, that's obviously not a good enough reason. So I would proactively write to them to say, Caroline, great news. Effective from next Monday, we're delighted to welcome you back to work. As we've been outlining in our previous correspondence, it's your obligation to come off the COVID payment effective that date because you're no longer on layoff, you're going to be returning to work. So again, it's very positive, a message that you're bringing, and ultimately the person doesn't choose to stay on COVID, for example, they are required to return unless there's obstacles. And if there's obstacles, again, like they would be ordinarily, we're obliged to tease them out in line with business requirements and reasonability.
But if there's no real obstacles, Caroline, your options if they say no is what?
if the person is saying no for no reason and there's no obstacle, you'll be writing to the person to confirm that they're not fulfilling their contractual obligation if they don't return on Monday, the whatever date, and you'll ask them to confirm their position in that regard. So again, I think at that stage, you'll be getting into formal correspondence to ensure that you're covering yourself. But I think we're finding that once you proactively tell the person your COVID payments ends the day you're due to return, which is this date, if they continue to be absent after that, we need to consider a different type of absence, whether that's unpaid leave, sick leave, etc., depending on, you know, what the issue is. But I think the proactive communication has been helpful in addressing that issue.
Great. And I suppose as I asked Colette just to pull up the final question there, or the final, the answers to the last poll, which I think is interesting. You know, we're seeing probably the majority of people sitting somewhere between 35 and about 70 or so % in terms of hoping to return their employees, which is all positive news. But there is, you know, a respect to the fact that, you know, some people will expect 35% or less of their employees to get back to work in 2020, which brings me to my final question, Caroline, which is really around this area of collective redundancies. So a question been asked here, one of the criteria for collective redundancies is to contact the Minister for Employment Affairs and Social Protection and provide them with different information. One requirement is to provide the names of the employee associations, unions and dates on which consultation took place and the progress achieved in those consultations. What should one do when both a union and a staff association is absent in the workplace?
Ultimately, they're all working behind the scenes. I mean, so even if they mightn't be physically at work, they are working, you know. So I've had lots of consultation with many of the unions around the country in the last number of weeks, and they're all actively working. I think the obligation to consult and engage is crucial. And it is, I suppose, in light of the business case, you know, so I think it's important that we address it in that regard. And I think failure to consult will end up with, you know, much bigger consequences, not alone the legal obligations not being met, but you're also, I suppose, creating issues from a staff fairness point of view. So I would say I would be consulting as proactively as you can, as early as you can. And, you know, we know that the collective redundancy requires, you know, a 30-day period, but I would be consulting as early as possible, because for a lot of people, they're still on a COVID payment or, you know, some payment. So giving them lots of notice is positive, even though we know the notice requirement is depending on their length of service or their contractual obligations. But I would say engage early and proactively, which has been a theme, I think, of all our advice, you know, over the last set of videos and again over this set of videos. Like, everybody knows that this is challenging times. It's difficult for the employer, it's difficult for those working in HR, it's difficult for employees, but being proactive, being informed, consulting and being empathetic mean that we're going to get there a lot more positively to the end outcome that we need to get there to anyway. So I think that would be probably my parting advice, you know, to just, you know, bite the bullet and try and proactively engage early and facilitate that consultation as we go.
I'm just interpreting this question in the event that there isn't a union involved in the business. Obviously, there must be some kind of a staff consultation committee, or you'd have to put one in place in light of this.
You would, and I suppose I'm also a big fan of ensuring as much individual engagement occurs as possible. And if it is the case that you get to a stage of collective redundancy, it's normally a case of potentially the business closing. You know, we've seen businesses are going into liquidation. You know, there's all types of backdrops to that. But again, I think it's the more you engage both individually and collectively, the better it is in that regard. And like, we hope that redundancies will be a last resort, but in reality, based on that last poll and based on the feedback we're seeing, you know, it's a reality that unfortunately may be something that we need to look at for businesses. But again, it's making sure we do it with all those things I mentioned, the positive engagement at the outset in terms of engaging early, in terms of making sure we do the paper trail, in terms of making sure people are being heard, which is a hugely important part of this process, and giving them a voice.
Great. I'm conscious we're running a little over time, but just as we go to the last question, I might ask Colette to just pull up our last poll there. And just for people, if they feel that the webinar has helped them reconsider or look at elements of their HR plan and alternative ways of reducing the numbers you expect to make redundant, you might let us know on that. So just as I recap, next steps now, the options that we are looking at now in terms of what do I do now, from our point of view, just in terms of summarising, it would be firstly to keep up to date with the latest information and updates on our COVID-19 business supports website at falchireland.ie, to update your COVID staff policy and other HR policies and staff handbook. And hopefully you've kind of got a sense between watching the videos and Caroline's insights today of, other areas of your policies and handbook that you may need to look at. Review the checklist that we have developed for you on that HR for reopening page on the return to work safely protocol, because I think it's just a great checklist to make sure that the workload around this is spread across the management team, and you can put that in place. And as Caroline said, there's guidance there as well for the role of the worker representative in all of that as well. Have a look at the templates that we've given you for the return to work questionnaire, which is a mandatory questionnaire that all staff have to provide to their employer before they go back to work, and start to put those arrangements and consultation in place. And then to make sure that you put your staff communications plan in place now to advise staff on reopening and staffing resource plans. And I know this is not going to be, an easy process. I think for many people out there, despite how seasoned you are as HR professionals and owners and managers of business, this is probably an exercise that you hopefully have never had to do before. And it's not going to be an easy exercise. But as Caroline says, tread carefully. Please follow the guidance that she has outlined in great detail on the videos, particularly that third video in terms of handling short time redundancy and changes in worker arrangements and the associated paper trail on that. So just to wrap up at this point, I would say thank you very much for your time and attention this afternoon. We hope you've found it useful and that it's offered you some clarity around the HR job of work to be done in preparation for reopening. You know what they say, it's a hell of a lot more challenging to reopen a business than it is to shut down, and that is definitely true in regard to HR. Can I remind you, if we didn't manage to address your question today, either through the presentation or live Q&A, we are preparing a subsequent FAQ guide to support the webinar, and we'll attempt to address your question there, or you're welcome to contact us on our business supported email address now on your screen, or contact your local Fáilte Ireland representative as well. Our sincere thanks to Caroline McEnery today for her time in what is such a busy schedule for her and her team at the HR Suite. To Colette, to Ian, to Karen, thank you for your support today on keeping us on webinar and live for the audience. And as we promised you in our last webinar, and as many of you may already be aware and signed up to it, we now have our online staff training resources and programs available for your business to register. On our Fáilte Ireland main site. Simply check into the industry portal section under the enterprise development calendar, and I know Ian is going to provide you there with a link in the chat box to that. And for those of you who haven't previously signed up for the portal, there will be an opportunity to sign up there and register for those supports if you want. And then finally, just to say that there's also a really good blog on our site around upskilling during COVID-19 on the main Fáilte Ireland website, so check that out as well. Which covers some details of other free training that's available with our sister agencies and support organisations and some commercial bodies out there who are giving some of their training free. That's really, really welcome there. So finally then, Colette, I might just take that last poll response before we close out, if we have it there available. So I'm delighted to say, you know, the webinar and the supports we've provided are at least able to influence and support some of you to reconsider your options around redundancies. And hopefully, you know, if you've got more questions around that, please reach out to your local Fudge Ireland representative who can assist you and guide you if there's additional questions got to be asked there. For me, it just remains to thank you all very much, to remind you on behalf of our CEO Paul Kelly, our director team, and all the local team at Fudge Ireland, we continue to be here to support you on the road to recovery. So please continue to reach out and contact your local Fudge Ireland representative or email us to keep us advised of your support needs. And finally, to remind you to check the COVID Business Supports Hub for the latest news and resources at all times, which we have available, and we'll bring you on a day-to-day update basis. And last but not least, to each of you, to your teams, to your families and to your loved ones, stay safe, stay well, and remember, we're in it together. Ganairi and Boherlat, go raibh gae de bra ar de chúl, agus go raibh míle maithe gaibh slán go fóill.